Invasion. On a small island in the Pacific Ocean, life was measured in calm. Its inhabitants, mostly farmers and fishermen, were engaged in agriculture and fishing. The island was far from large civilizations, and its inhabitants lived in harmony with nature. People were happy with their lives, enjoying each day and working on the land. The harvest was rich, and the seas were full of fish, providing the inhabitants with everything they needed. But one day, something changed. Rats appeared out of nowhere. No one noticed them at first, and when they began to actively reproduce, it was too late. They began to destroy crops, rummage through barns, and spoil food supplies. These rodents were not just a nuisance, they threatened the very existence of the island. Their activity became especially noticeable at night. Farmer Takashi was one of the first to realize the scale of the problem. One morning he came to his barn with rice and discovered that in just a few nights the rats had destroyed his entire supply. Panic gripped the island. This event became a turning point for the inhabitants. What had previously seemed like a minor problem became a real threat to survival. The island was under attack from an invisible enemy, and the people needed to find a way to cope with the situation, otherwise they could lose their land and existence on it. A futile struggle. At first, the islanders tried to fight the rats with the usual methods, using traps and poison. However, the rats turned out to be extremely smart and tenacious. They quickly learned to avoid traps, and poison did not always have the desired effect. Every attempt to stop their growth ended in failure, and the number of rodents only increased. The rats continued to attack fields, barns, and even houses, destroying everything in their path. The locals began to desperately fight them, but their efforts were in vain. Soon panic spread throughout the island. People were afraid that if they did not find a way to solve the problem, they would be left without food and, perhaps, without a future. In desperation, the local mayor, Hiroshi, called a meeting to discuss possible solutions. It became clear that the situation required drastic measures. The island was on the brink of an ecological disaster. People began to realize that the usual methods of fighting rats were no longer working and that radical measures were needed to save the island. An unexpected solution. At the Council of Elders, when the discussion of the problem reached a dead end, Hiroshi proposed an unconventional solution to bring cats to the island. These natural predators could become a natural way to control the rat population. The idea seemed unusual, but in the current circumstances, it seemed logical. Cats were known for their ability to catch rodents, and many residents began to agree with this proposal. However, not everyone shared this idea. Some doubted that the brought cats could become a problem in themselves, because no one knew how they would behave in a new place. But after long discussions, it became clear that there was no other solution. If they did not solve the rat problem, the island could become uninhabitable. Takashi, who was worried about his fields, decided to go to the mainland with a group of volunteers to collect 1,000 cats from different parts of the country. It was a risky but necessary decision. Takashi hoped that the cats would be able to return the island to its usual order and that life on it would become calm again. The arrival of the army of cats. Several weeks passed, and finally 1,000 cats of different breeds and sizes were delivered to the island. In the first days, they were cautious and wary as they explored their new territory. It was an unknown place for them, and the cats got used to the island, sniffed it, trying to understand what was happening here. However, soon the animal instincts took over. The cats began to actively hunt. First of all, they hunted rats, which had previously been the main source of concern for the inhabitants. It was a real cleansing process. Cats patrolled the streets, barns, and fields, methodically and quickly reducing the rodent population. Within a few days, it became clear that the number of rats began to decrease. The islanders, watching this process, felt relieved. Of course, the cats did not solve all the problems at once, but the situation was clearly improving. Soon, the rats no longer got into the houses. The crops were safe. People began to understand that their trust in the unusual solution was justified. But despite this, no one could yet imagine what consequences this intervention would bring in the future. Chapter 5. First Successes. A few months passed since the cats appeared, and the results became obvious. The islanders began to notice the changes. The rats no longer got into the houses, and the crops were safe again. For farmers like Takashi, this was a real relief. His rice fields were no longer attacked by pests, and he could go about his business in peace. People began to be grateful to the cats, realizing how important their role was. They began to look at these animals not as just furry pets, but as protectors of their island. The cats brought harmony and security to the island, and the inhabitants felt that their island had become what it used to be. However, success did not mean that the problems were solved completely. A new threat was already looming on the horizon. What seemed like salvation could become the cause of new challenges. But this will be in the next chapters, when the island will face the consequences of the cat invasion of the ecosystem. Now, if necessary, I can continue with the description of the remaining chapters. Cats become masters. Over time, the cats began to adapt to the new living conditions on the island. Their numbers continued to grow because natural predators have an incredible ability to reproduce, especially when they are provided with comfortable conditions. There were no natural enemies on the island, and food supplies were available thanks to the disappearance of rats. Following this, the cat population began to grow rapidly. The islanders soon realized that the rodents were no longer a problem, but now they were faced with a new challenge. Cats began to become not only protectors, but also real masters of the island. Cats walked freely along the streets, explored abandoned houses, and some even began to settle in them, creating real cat shelters. For the locals, this became both a curiosity and a cause for concern. They noticed that cats began to dominate the other animals on the island. There was no longer room for dogs or other local animals. Cats occupied every corner of the island, and they became an everyday part of life. One of the most noticeable changes occurred in agriculture. At first, cats were welcome neighbors of farmers, protecting barns from rats. But it soon became obvious that they were now interfering with the normal course of life on the island. In the fields, where ordinary farm animals used to reign, cats began to walk, sometimes interfering with the work of farmers. In houses, it also became difficult to avoid the presence of these small predators. They became not just a part of the ecosystem, but real neighbors with whom they had to live in a new, unusual rhythm. With each passing year, the island became more and more cat-like. Not only did cats begin to walk the streets, but their behavior also became more and more confident. The island was slowly turning into a kind of cat kingdom, where people were no longer the main owners. Cats now ruled the island. For many, this became a source of comfort, watching cats hunt, play, fill the streets. But for others, it became obvious that the island was beginning to lose its original atmosphere. The locals did not know how to cope with the new situation because on the one hand, cats were useful, and on the other, they created new problems. It was time to make a decision. New problem? After a few years, the island became almost entirely populated by cats. The rats disappeared, but with them, the natural balance disappeared. Problems began to appear much later, when the number of cats became excessive. The cats began to reproduce so quickly that soon the number of animals began to threaten the island's ecosystem. Without natural enemies, the cat population grew too quickly, and at some point they began to get out of control. Not only did they continue to hunt rats, which seemed to be gone, but they also began to catch local birds. This upset the natural balance of the island. Birds that had previously lived peacefully on the island were now in danger of extinction. Cats, having caught more and more birds, destroyed the ecosystem, which had previously been stable and harmonious. The problem became so acute that the residents gathered again for a meeting. They realized that the situation was getting out of control. The island, which was the source of their food and peaceful life, was in danger. The ecosystem was being destroyed, and local animal species were suffering from too many predators. The locals turned to scientists and ecologists who could help understand the situation and find a way to stop this ecological crisis. There was a need to find solutions to restore balance on the island. Scientists' research. The situation on the island attracted the attention of scientists. Biologists, ecologists, and wildlife experts arrived on the island to investigate the problem and propose solutions. They began to study the cat population, their behavior, and the impact on the local fauna and flora. Based on their research, the scientists came to the conclusion that in order to restore balance, it was necessary to introduce measures to control the cat population. One of the proposed solutions was to create special areas for cats to live freely without interfering with the ecological order. Another option was to sterilize cats to prevent them from reproducing. This solution caused controversy among the island's residents. Some locals supported the idea of sterilization and the creation of controlled areas for cats, believing that this is the only way to return the island to its natural beauty and its previous balance. However, there were those who did not support the intervention of scientists. Some residents believed that interference in nature was disrupting its natural course, and that cats should live freely, as they were accustomed to. The dispute between those who supported control and those who supported freedom for cats became increasingly heated. People could not come to a consensus, and this only exacerbated the problem. Chapter 9. Cat Tourism. The situation on the island, despite the environmental problems, attracted the attention of tourists. The story of cats, who became the main inhabitants of the island, quickly spread throughout the world. Tourists began to come to see this unique and unusual island, where cats were not just pets, but full-fledged residents with whom they had to coexist. Tourism became an important part of the island's economy. Hotels and restaurants began to open, and the island became a popular tourist destination. People from all over the world came to admire this unusual place, where cats walked the streets, and people lived in harmony with them. But tourism also brought problems. The influx of tourists increased the load on the island's infrastructure. New problems emerged, such as pollution and lack of resources. In addition, the process of caring for the cats became more and more expensive as their numbers continued to grow. With each passing year, the island became more and more dependent on tourism, and locals began to ask themselves how to maintain a balance between nature conservation and economic development. The fact is that tourism brought in profit, but at the same time complicated the solution of environmental problems. Residents accept cats. As time went on, the islanders began to adapt to the new conditions. Cats became not just protectors from rats or ecosystem predators. They became an important part of the life of every person on the island. Locals began to take care of the cats, build shelters for them, and feed them. Cats became beloved pets, and many residents even began to give them names like pets. Each family on the island had their own cat, which became a part of their daily life. In some homes, cats occupied an important place, and people treated them with great love and respect. Even those who were once skeptical about cats began to appreciate their role in the life of the island. However, despite this love for cats, the problems with their numbers did not disappear. Now residents began to understand that cats require much more attention and care. The problem with the ecosystem in which cats occupied a dominant position remained relevant. Difficulties of coexistence. Not all island residents were happy with the changes. With the development of tourism on the island, the number of people visiting it began to grow. Some locals began to believe that there were too many tourists, and this disrupted their usual rhythm of life. Traffic, noise, overloaded infrastructure, all this became a heavy burden for those who preferred a quiet life on the island. In addition, the conflict over the control of the cat population did not disappear. Some residents were in favor of complete control and intervention by scientists, believing that this was the only way to avoid further environmental problems, while others insisted on allowing the cats to live freely, without human interference. This disharmony created tensions between the different groups on the island. Balance found. After much discussion and debate, residents, authorities, and scientists found a compromise. In order to satisfy the needs of all parties, they decided to limit tourism to the island, reducing the number of visitors to a safe level. At the same time, measures were introduced to control the number of cats. Special areas were created for cats to live and reproduce freely, but in other parts of the island, population control rules were introduced. Sterilization programs for cats were also organized to prevent their excessive reproduction. This allowed the number of animals to be reduced without violating their natural rights to exist. The island became an example of how to find a balance between animal freedom and human interests. Ultimately, the island became a symbol of harmony between man and nature, an example of how to solve ecosystem problems without harming either side. And although the island faced new challenges, the inhabitants realized that their island could continue to live in harmony with nature and people if they maintained this balance. Thus ended one chapter in the island's history, but there were still many adventures and decisions ahead.